Welcome all to Oxford for Europe's meeting on the future relations between the UK and the EU. Is there potential for any hope? We're absolutely delighted that you can all attend tonight. I'm just going to briefly give an overview of our eminent speakers, and then I will hand over firstly to David and then to Alex, and we will have questions at the end. You'll all be muted so that it's easy for there's no interference, and we will have Geraldine and Susan will ask your questions on your behalf. Our first speaker tonight is David Hennig, who was previously an advisor for a number of years on trade investment to the UK government. He's currently director of the Trade Policy Project at ESIPE, which is the European Centre for International Political Economy, an advisor to the UK Trade and Business Commission, and a regular and insightful commentator on all things trade. I'd encourage you all to have a look at the ESIPE website. It's really informative, and I particularly enjoyed David's blog on the Windsor Framework, the push and pull factors which enabled a breakthrough this a couple of weeks ago. Spoiler alert, we didn't hold all the cards. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David, who I believe will speak on the UK side of the equation. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Lizzie. Good evening, or depending on who you're in other geographies, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Next time I appear on a joint session with Alex, I shall do this from in front of my large collection of music as well. But Alex has rather outclassed me on that score. But I can assure you that in another room, that rather looks like that. I'm fresh back from Brussels today. I kind of have been going there roughly once a month for the last few months. So although Alex is going to talk about the generally the view from the EU, I might chip in on the odd moment. But mostly I'm going to talk about what's happened. And I think when we first planned this, it was a few months ago. I think things have changed a bit. I can't remember whether it was during the during the Truss period. It might have been, and it's things do seem to have changed a bit. So that's what I'm going to I'm going to run through in the next few minutes, and really in three ways I'm going to pick this up. One, agreements. Things are actually being agreed between the UK and the EU. That's clearly a change, but I think underlying it there is a change of sentiment going on in UK politics. So let's have a little bit of a look at that and what's going on there. And I think thirdly, that change of sentiment has been such that even the Labour Party has noticed it, and their position is evolving as well. So let's talk a little bit about that, and also maybe perhaps, well, what would a Labour government, if there was one, what would that mean? So thinking that I was going to run through those in turn. So let's start with agreements. Let's start with the Windsor Framework. Actually, let's start with the data agreement that came at the end of January. And that's very unobtrusive. Somebody was reminding me yesterday, this was slipped out on a Friday afternoon, that the UK had agreed that the EU could have access to data on movements going across from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And that was the first sign that things were changing. And it was an agreement. And not only was it an agreement, it was an agreement without any kind of previous walkouts, yelling, headlines in the newspaper that we would make the EU suffer or whatever. No theatrics. There was just an agreement. So okay, that's quite interesting. And then for the next few weeks, really, the next 3 or 4 weeks, there was kind of rumours that actually there was already a deal had been done. Subsequently, there's been lots of denials that was already a deal done, and various sort of false starts as to when it was going to be agreed. And then we had the badly named Windsor Framework. It's very badly named because many of you will know it was actually reached in a hotel that is just outside Windsor. Even worse, it's in Surrey. And quite near where Magna Carta was signed, actually. But I suppose we couldn't call it Magna Carta 2. It's not quite of that level. What does the agreement do? Well, at the headline level, the agreement was again something the UK and the EU reached an agreement on about trade with regard to Northern Ireland, which has been a long-running issue. I'm not going to. I mean, I can go into chapter and verse of this. I've written at length several times over about the issues that Northern Ireland was always going to bring when you have a UK government that wanted to diverge, and Northern Ireland, which has a structural ambiguity in the way in its own political positioning, but also shares a land border with the the EU. Suffice to say, the Windsor Agreement framework was reached, in which both the UK and the EU compromised. The EU allowed supermarkets from Great Britain to send their goods unaltered essentially to Northern Ireland, but with certain conditions applying to that, not surprisingly. There was something called the Stormont Break, which is a very complex thing that has been wildly oversold by the UK government, but it certainly gives Northern Ireland politicians at least some chance of opportunity of a say. There was more structured framework between Northern Ireland business and the UK and the EU, and plenty of small print, but essentially there's an agreement there. Unclear whether that will actually get past the Unionists. We're not quite sure what will happen. I suspect it'll be a sort of slightly uneasy position for the next for the next period of time, while the Unionists don't quite say yes and don't quite say no, and the thing kind of goes through anyway. It's pretty clear it's got the votes in Parliament. Surprisingly, not overly hostile response from most of the ERG. So perhaps there's a change coming, and I'll come back to that. It was announced that talks would restart on UK accession to Horizon, the science programme. So that was good news to follow. Although subsequently the UK government has been sort of, I think, in a misguided attempt to be playing it tough, has been suggesting that maybe that's not something they still want to do. But that opened up that set of discussions. Even, I know, it opened up international discussions where the UK may join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been on hold because the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill got dropped, and so that was another important part of the equation. The Protocol Bill was dropped. It was an international disaster. Everybody was, the US. I was having complaints from the US, Japan, Australia. That was dropped. So that was all positive as well. UK and EU reaching agreement. Now there's a lot of small print in there. A lot of it is not being analysed properly, and one of the things that we need to look at is do we actually know what we're signing up to? Not necessarily so far. Are there lots of other agreements that could really be useful? Yes, but one step at a time, we have an agreement. And what that I think has revealed since it was signed, but you could already sense it happening. And the second point I'm going to make about was a change of sentiment. ERG powers are fading, but more importantly, you're no longer getting too many people saying, "Oh, we don't really need any deals with the EU." That's just kind of disappeared. No deal is better than a bad deal. Haven't heard that one for a while either. We got to deal without sort of yelling. Obviously, the economics of Brexit are going quite badly. The economics of the UK are going quite badly. Brexit is seen as by the general population at large as not having lived up to its brochure. It doesn't mean that everybody would immediately vote to rejoin tomorrow, but even large numbers of those who voted leave now thinking, maybe it was maybe it's not quite delivering. And obviously, we have got into this cycle of overselling. We're seeing with the Windsor framework the way it is being oversold by the government again, but original Brexit. So you've had this sense of overselling all the way through. But I have this feeling that the more it's oversold and the more it's not really delivering, the more people are kind of noticing. Well, it didn't appear to make the NHS better. Obviously, tomatoes. I think that sort of story has cut through. People notice they have that they're not getting tomatoes, or and that you regularly get little bits of foodstuffs not there. Trade deals, the great hope we were going to do lots of new trade deals. We did one with Australia and one with New Zealand. They're not actually even implemented yet, but that's not obviously shifted the dial. But in March 2023, I mean, we actually fully left everything to do with the EU at the end of 2020. And sorry, and yeah, it was the end of, and how time flies when we're having fun. But we still haven't actually had those new trade deals. So that sense of overselling, that sense it's not going to plan, and the language is changing. And then the Windsor Framework comes out. Brexiteers like David Davis suddenly decide it's okay again. Now, some of this might be Conservative Party, their old desire for power, nothing more dangerous than the Conservative Party when they think they might lose. They suddenly discover that actually they might try some pragmatism, and so drop some of the previous positions. But there is that definite change going on around the politics, and the national sentiment. So that's helping to facilitate a different conversation with the EU. And then we have the next election factor. Labour suggesting they would go further. Now, it's last July that Keir Starmer made his speech at a CER event. I was there when he laid out the 5 things that Labour would do, and at that time, they didn't feel necessarily very adventurous, but at least they were a step further. They were, we will do a food and drink agreement that will help resolve the Northern Ireland situation. We won't go back in the single market, we won't go back in the customs union or rejoin, but we will have a more constructive relationship. But what I find interesting is that they're going further now. There's increasing talk around about, okay, what can we do in terms of our regulation? Can we almost make it a general principle that we will align where we can and where it makes sense with EU regulation? We're moving away from this idea that all divergence is good. Now, well, maybe some divergence is good, or maybe in some cases we won't have a choice because EU regulation doesn't really allow us to follow, and that's possible. It's not always possible to align with EU regulation when you're outside it. But that dialogue is changing in the Labour Party, and of course with an election coming up within by the end of next year, we assume it could be in January of 2025. Those conversations are developing, and they'll probably continue to develop for the next 18 months. The emphasis, again, returning to my field in trade, the emphasis again coming back to gravity, that we need to trade more with our nearest partners. That's kind of coming back into fashion, but very much that's what you would hear from, I think, from Labour. Okay, we actually need to trade, and we need to engage much more with the EU. So Labour's moving that bit further, I would argue, than the general sort of sentiment. So the general sentiment is moving towards better EU ties. Labour's moving that bit further. Now, I don't think it's going to go right into customs union, single market. In a sense, there's a danger that they sound like old arguments, and I really don't think Labour wants to have old arguments. But yeah, there is that definite sense that Labour feels it can move because public opinion and general political debate is moving. So I just want to spend the last sort of 2 or 3 minutes just looking at what happens next from a UK point of view before Alex tells me that everybody in the EU hates us and they never want to see us again. It's not true. My spoiler alert: people, when they go to Brussels, people are very friendly. Now they admit we're not their top priority, but they're very friendly. And so there's plenty of people want to help us. I'm sort of interviewing what Alex is going to say. What happens next? Look, the politics is changing. You can see that, but the technical process is the technical process, and we've got used to it. Some very odd things happening in the last few years with regard to EU relations. We've got used to agreements that happen in a matter of months. Well, that's not actually normal. Normally, these things take time to work out the technicalities, and in a sense, we don't even know the technicalities. I was with yesterday evening, I was with various experts discussing the Stormont break and the Windsor framework, and none of us have exactly the same understanding of what it actually is or what it actually means. There are various of those sort of small print that will take time to come out. There's an assumption around which I think is dangerous, that there's a TCA review in 2025 and that lots can happen in that. Well, I'm not sure. Normally, those sort of reviews of trade agreements, not much does actually happen. Now, it could be used as part of a kind of reset, but only if the UK and EU politics believes in sort of restructuring that relationship. It's not clear we're quite at that point yet. There's a lot of technicalities where we talk about, Horizon, okay, but what about Erasmus? What about the old things about cultural visas, for example? The Pan-European Mediterranean Convention on Rules of Origin, very thrillingly named, but something that would really make trade easier around Europe. Can we join? Well, yeah, it would take time. These things don't just sort of fall straight into your lap. Still, the sense in the UK that we can have more influence in the with what the EU is doing. Not entirely clear that we've quite got our position outside of the EU fully sort of worked through yet, and still the sense that almost an expectation that we can achieve what we want with the EU. It's great that we got a relatively successful negotiation, but don't underestimate just how much the EU got in return for that. That it was there were two sides to this. I already mentioned that I think that if one is looking towards rejoining anything from the EU to the customs union to the single market, I think the entire political narrative would have to change. It would not be a matter, it can't just be about trade, it would have to be about the politics, it would have to be about the UK wanting to be a part of it and believing itself to be an influential part. It's quite odd almost that for some reason we think we weren't influential when we were members, but we could be influential when we're not members. And somehow you'd have to change that kind of narrative. My sense is it's going to be more a matter of gradual change rather than something suddenly happening. But I guess what I'm saying to the people in this virtual room is that yes, there is now a space in which you can feel that there's an opportunity, but that's a long way from perhaps what most of you would actually want to happen. And I suspect that right now, at a moment of perhaps of a bit more optimism, personally, I think that it will be still a long slog towards really fully normalising UK relations and having a really really big dialogue again or a referendum again on rejoining something or a new relationship. I sense, yes, you've got to a point where there's a bit of hope, but this could be like a false summit when if you're climbing mountains and you get over the first hill and then you see that there's another one beyond it, and then you realize there's another 10 beyond that, and I sense that actually, yes, a step forward, there's a long way to go. It's still to be defined, the future. But anyway, that's where I'll stop, and I'll hand over to Alex.
Sorry, I'll briefly introduce Alex, who is also an expert on law and trade, and it was an advisor to the government. He now currently is a man of many talents. I don't know where to start and stop, but anyway, acting, opera singing, chef. But the law and trade have not left him, as we know very much from his regular commentary on Brexit through his work at Best for Britain, with the Bunker podcast and the Oh God What Now podcast. has written for numerous publications, including the Byline Times, the New Statesman, and the Guardian. So, Alex, over to you. From the EU perspective, what path to hope can you offer us?
Right. So, I'm not here to crush your spirits. I am also feeling much more optimistic. There has been a change. There is definitely something in the air. I mean, in some capacities, I'm a sort of professional news watcher. And there is no doubt that the volume of news items, of opinion pieces, of bits of research on how Brexit is going, and the frankness of their assessment, even from Brexit-friendly quarters, is quadruple in volume and quality to what it had been this time last year. So there definitely seems to be a barrier that's broken, and now everyone can speak more freely about how Brexit is going. And I think that's a very good thing. And there is also a change in Brussels. Of course, Brussels doesn't hate Britain. You know, I have a very regular group of Commission contacts and contacts at the various directorates, and a few lawyers who work in legal firms in their headquarters in Brussels. And we have like a monthly Zoom catch-up, a sort of very big touching base, what's going on there and what's happening here. And yes, I do sense a change in the air. I think much of the change is to do with Brexit receding as an issue for Europe. You know, it's now a sort of a small page 8 or 9 item in the newspapers rather than a front page thing. And I think that gives a lot more room to everyone to strike deals, not under that intense scrutiny. I think the second reason that there is a change of the atmosphere in Brussels is because, how do I put this delicately? I think Brexit as a cautionary tale, Brexit as a disaster, that narrative is now so firmly established that Europe may be feeling that it can be slightly more gracious, actually. And so I think both of those are very, very positive developments. There is a but. I do think the debate over here is rather sterile and focused too much on economics. I completely agree with David on that. The economic arguments failed to convince a rump of people before the referendum. And I think continuing to press just them, I'm not saying we shouldn't press the economic arguments, obviously, but continuing to press just the economic arguments instead of making a wider, bigger case about the benefits of membership, something that I think as pro-Europeans we largely failed to do during the 4 decades of our membership. So continuing to just press the economic arguments implies to me a belief that the country took a very temporary leave of its senses, and it's gone back to rationalism now. And I think what we're seeing with small boat crossings, with, you know, the Lineker thing, with our immigration debate, with a lot of things, is that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I think people are still as ruled by the lizard part of their brain as they ever were. And the notion that we can now just concentrate on a purely economic argument and everyone will be on board, I think is quite naive. The second way in which I think the debate is wanting is that it is often, in my view, too Anglocentric. It simply assumes that rejoining is merely a matter of the UK asking to. And that is definitely not the case. I think a recognition, a profound popular recognition that this isn't so is one of the conditions that will signal to the EU that we might be ready for a closer relationship. You know, so if we stop thinking that it's all about us, we will have fulfilled a really vital condition for belonging again to this sort of collaborative group. So I have discerned a pattern in my conversations with my Brussels contacts. I think I see 4 necessary conditions that are repeated to me again and again and again by various people in slightly different terms. But I think they are what is necessary from the European point of view for a gradual defrosting of relations. The first, as I said, is that realization that we are the applicant, right? We would be the applicant, not in control of the process, not in a position to make demands, and needing unanimous support. This is absolutely vital. You know, any EU member can veto the joining of a new EU member. So we need every single country on board with this. I really cannot stress this enough. It must be seen as joining rather than rejoining. I think this rejoining thing is going to be a big millstone around our neck. And it's actually a very negative message to be sending to the general public, because it implies a sort of regression, a sort of negative situation. So I think we have to start seeing it as joining afresh, right? Rather than rejoining. The second condition is, and I hear this from absolutely everyone, is that there has to be bipartisan buy-in, right? The 2 parties that are possible governments at the moment in this country have to be on board with major changes, not just with rejoining, like with a new veterinary agreement, with a mutual recognition of professional standards. There has to be that bipartisan buy-in, because the EU would not want a sort of hokey-cokey where we enter an agreement under a Labour government, and then the next government is a Tory government and takes us out of this agreement, and we do all of this destructive thing again, right? Stability with the UK outside the EU is preferable to the UK than the constant instability of in-out. This is key for us to understand. And I think the more mature politicians actually on this, they get that. I think that's what the Ditchley Park meeting was about, right? It was to take the temperature of how far this government could go in order to not antagonize the other side. Would it have supporting voices on the other side? It does also, the Ditchley Park meeting contains, I think, the implicit admission that Labour will probably form the next administration, which is quite an incredible thing. The other 2 conditions are much simpler and take a lot of hard work and time. The first one, and I hear this again from, not from everyone, the figure, as it were, but from a lot of people, is that the European Union would look for stable support in the polls over time in the high 60s for any kind of, let's say, single market membership or a sort of EEA type deal. They wouldn't go in on it on 55-45, right? That is simply too unstable a situation. And we would probably need another referendum to ratify that radical a move. And the last condition is the rebuilding of trust. And that is something that cannot be rushed. And it is something that depends on us keeping to the agreements that we've already signed for a sustained period of time and signing the next little block of agreements and keeping to that. All right? And that does take time. In my view, much of the Remain lobby at the moment is basically just kicking Starmer's chair from behind and going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? We have to fight smarter than that, right? So my view on the way forward is we need to stop concentrating on the mechanics. We need to stop concentrating on the titles, remoiners, rejoiners, whatevers, and start concentrating on the reality, right? This is a project. It's a big project, and it must be managed as a project. We have to create the conditions within which the project can happen, and we have to break it down into small, goal-oriented, achievable subtasks and bank a series of victories that take us in the direction that we want to go. I think it's very useful to think of it as, think of the UK as unmoored from the EU at the moment, okay? With every passing day, with every argument, with every bit of legislation, with every tiny piece of divergence, we drift further away from the European Union. The first task is not to dock. The first task is to stop that drift. And that is the value of even seemingly small agreements, like a veterinary agreement or an agreement on professional standards. They stop that drift. They anchor us back into EU legislation, okay? The next task is to get within mooring distance. So the next task will be a gradual process where both parties approach each other and get to a position where we can begin to discuss docking again, right? And in order to do that, I think we have to understand really how, despite what we want it to be, how the situation actually is in this country. I think there is a majority in this country of people who delegate their moral judgment to tabloid headlines. And there has always been. It is smaller now than it used to be, but it is there. And I think it manifests itself in debates which are framed in terms of tabloid headlines, right? Underneath that, there is nuance. For instance, take the debate on the death penalty, okay? You do a poll saying, shall we bring back the death penalty, framed in a tabloid way? And you get a small majority of people saying, yes, bring it back. You ask people, which crime should attract the death penalty? And you find that there isn't even a small majority for any particular crime attracting the death penalty. And so what I'm trying to say is, if we keep framing the debate in really broad terms that capture headlines, that goes against us. As progressives, intelligent debate is our friend, nuance is our friend, detail is our friend, follow-up questions are our friends, okay? We don't want to be on the front page. We don't want Keir Starmer to make some grand gesture that he will rejoin in the next term, which is something the EU would never accept anyway. We want to be in page 4, in page 5, buried in the financial items, buried in the business news, a small item that says, we now have a deal on insurance, a small item that says, we now have a deal that removes this non-tariff barrier, okay? So separate what you need emotionally and how quickly you need it emotionally, and let's be smart and understand what we need practically, that we are several steps away from rejoin, and let's be clever about them. That's all for me. For starters, obviously.
Thank you so much. So what I take from both of those before we move to questions is there is a move towards pragmatism in what we see with the Windsor framework, and we have to be incredibly patient and within our own national politics. And I very much appreciate your metaphor of the ship moving further away from being moored, and it's incremental, slow, and we have to look very much within ourselves. But I think we make a lot of sense, and I think thank you both very much for your time and generosity. Now we're going to move to Susan and to Geraldine to ask some questions which have been coming in.
Thank you. The first one is quite a quick, a short question, but maybe a longer answer, and it comes from Ruvi. And Ruvi asks, could the current Stop the Boats bill and the UK Retained Law bill threaten the future relationship with the EU? And if so, to what extent? David, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, and apologies, I actually meant to mention the Retained EU Law bill, but so much to cover, so little time. Look, if either the Retained EU Law bill or the Stop the Boats bill, ban the boats and whatever, were meant actually to be passed and to be serious pieces of legislation, then yes, but they're not. The Retained EU Law bill is obviously completely mad. Every single business organisation opposes it. Pretty much every single third sector organisation opposes it. It might manage to get 100 votes in the House of Lords, but it might struggle that far. You've got Conservative MPs hoping that it's going to be ditched. At some point in the next 6 months, they will find a way of somehow watering it down, ditching it completely, or whatever. I mean, it was so obviously keeping that going in order to help get the Northern Ireland Protocol deal through, and then with the intention of doing something with it. I mean, in reality, it would just be a massive own goal. It probably that one. I mean, people do say, in theory, the EU can take sanctions if the UK reduce levels of environmental and various other protections. Chances actually would be that it wouldn't be so obvious. That's actually quite a difficult clause to use in a trade deal. Chances are that what will actually happen with the Retained EU Law bill would keep the most obvious things, that it would just create total kind of legal chaos. The Stop the Boats bill, the point is with the ECHR, if the UK really ever left the ECHR, that would fatally undermine the Good Friday Agreement. For starters, it would also undermine part of the TCA that as relates to legal framework. But it's not even going to get that far, because if it undermined the Good Friday Agreement, the US would tell us to stop doing it, and the government would stop doing it. I mean, I think if you're learning one thing from all of this, it's that one of the big flaws in the whole sort of Brexit plan was that the US was meant to be a friend of Brexit, whereas particularly because of the Northern Ireland politics, the US is right, but it's not just about that. The US is right on the UK's case of saying, no, you're actually European. We don't actually want you kind of in the US or thinking you're in the US, and the UK government has to listen. That's just the nature of it. So yes, in theory, but no, in practice, these bills are sort of cheap political distractions to in the hope of appealing to Alex's friends who get influenced by the tabloid media. And I'm not actually sure it's working even with most of them, because there's only so many times you can promise to burn the boats or whatever you're doing before people realize that you're actually doing no such thing.
We will see.
Well, we will see. Well, it's a good test. I don't object to
there is a school of thought. There is a school of thought that you can keep serving this reheated tripe infinitely and people will still go for it. We'll find out soon enough.
Thanks, David. Anything else to add, Alex?
No, I think that's spot on. I think they're both performative nonsense that will never really see the light of day. The only marginal difference instinct I might have is that if the Lords amend the retained EU law bill to kick the deadline further into the distance, then the government might actually go for that, because that will make it an electoral issue. They will be in the position to keep asking Labour, so will you stick to that deadline to get rid of all EU legislation by 2026, let's say. And so I think that would suit them quite well politically, and I can see it going in that direction.
Thank you both very much. Geraldine has the next question.
We're hearing about the Georgians and Ukrainians wanting to join the EU now. They're making the case for it as a community of values. Will this help pro-rejoin people's argument in the UK in future?
I mean, I think in broad terms, yes, because the discussion and debate that goes with any country joining the European Union will necessarily be a discussion of the pros and cons of being in that club. And so that, I think, will refresh that idea in people's head. And also, you know, I think that there hasn't really been a big bit of enlargement for a while. And I think people have lost sight of the emotional importance, the link to stability and peace and democracy that comes with seeing people like we saw in, 2001, celebrating in the streets in Poland and the Czech Republic, because they felt like they were really entering a union that effectively westernized them. I know that's a ghastly term, but you understand what I'm saying, that took them outside the instability, the threat of sort of constant dictatorship, the economic misery, and put them in a different chapter. And so I think all those images and all that debate is incredibly useful, because there will be people, and we can see it in the polling, right? There are people peeling off constantly all the time. And there's also demographic change that favors the Remain movement, or the Rejoin movement, or the Join movement. I should start heeding my own advice. And seeing those images will refresh things for them. But a little proviso here, which I neglected to mention before, is that this demographic shift that is seen to favor internationalist or pro-European thinking was established at a time when we were a member of the European Union. As time moves on and we get even younger people coming into the voting pool, that won't be automatic for them. They won't remember what it was like traveling to Europe when there were no border queues. So the case has to be made afresh for the benefit of young people joining the voting pool, if nothing else, right? Because they are new to this debate. And that I think is a really useful device to keep us honest in the way we articulate our argument. You have to, if you always consider that you're articulating that argument for a 14-year-old that doesn't remember what it was like being in the EU, I think that's a really, really good syllogistical constraint to apply to ourselves.
Thank you.
So the next question is from Joe, and it's, do you get the feeling that currently in the UK that the mood music is changing, that there are enough people that would accept joining Schengen and the prospect of having the euro, or would that still be a stumbling block to joining?
Oh, right. I will take that. And I mean, I'm now going to sort of do my usual, that I've been far too nice to everyone, and I'm now going to claim everybody's wrong. I think it's a real mistake that is made constantly in saying that we know what the EU membership, if the UK was ever to seek that in the future, that we know that what that would entail. And there's this thing, but it would entail joining Schengen, it would entail being in the Eurozone, or whatever. Well, yeah, it might do. I know that's strictly speaking the rules, but accession negotiations still have an element of negotiation on, and there still is a case that, depending on what the exact politics are of the future, you can't be sure about it. And I think, picking up on a point that Alex has just been talking about the Georgia and Ukraine situation, it has actually reminded the EU, as well as lots of other people, that the EU was supposed to be an inclusive project. It wasn't supposed to be a strictly legalistic project. So if there is a great view in the UK in the future that, yes, the UK would love to be part of the EU on every respect except, for example, Schengen or the euro, would that actually be the factor that would stop it happening? No, I don't actually believe it would. Will you get that fact? You know, I personally, I wouldn't worry about what the conditionality will be. Will you get to the fact, as Alex said, where both major parties and 65% of the population believe that the UK should be in the EU? If you get that, then those other details can and would follow. But I believe it, you know, and I really find this part of the debate annoying on all sides, from Remain, Leave, whatever we call different people now. Too early. Think about the broad politics of this, about what the UK population want, what the EU population want. Worry about the details as and when that may be relevant, and it won't be for the next few years.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Anything to add?
I'll add something to that, just because, you know, I love making these grandiose claims about the far future, because, you know, if it doesn't happen, no one remembers. And if it does happen, I look like a bloody genius, right? So this is my penny's worth. I think there is a chance we will rejoin Schengen before any other kind of EU membership, because I think it is the annoyance of traveling to Europe, of those kinds of controls, of visas, and also of labor shortages over here. And it's a point that business will keep pressing relentlessly for years to come, that I can see not only us joining a sort of Schengen light before anything else happens, but I can see the Conservatives taking us into it. So obviously I can see a hugely dystopian future where they are completely taken over by the far right of their party, and, you know, and it all goes 1984. But I can also see a future where, let's say, they experience a drubbing at the next election and they decide to go more in the Cameron direction for their next electoral cycle, or the cycle after that. And one of the grand gestures that that Conservative Party could make is to make an argument for a better relationship with Europe, because that would indicate a real break with the dysfunctional politics of the Conservative Party, obsessed with seeing Europe as an adversary. So I can actually see that scenario in the next 10 years. I can really see a situation where the Conservatives become the main driving force of us having a closer relationship with Europe in that sense, because it suits business.
Thank you, Alex. I think I may need to have a glass of whatever it is you've been drinking.
No, come on, listen.
That Peter Bone may one say.
Mystic Meg died today. In her honor, I am offering this horoscopal prediction.
Thank you both. Geraldine.
Okay, so the next question is from Paul Brown. Would a switch from first past the post to proportional representation reassure EU members that the UK won't rejoin only to leave again? Which of you would like to answer that?
I'm happy to start that. I mean, there are so many good reasons to reform our electoral system. I think to even talk about the effect of reassuring the EU for the future is way down that list. yes, it will have that effect, of course. But, we should be reforming this dysfunctional system that consistently sees a minority rule for all kinds of reasons, not least of which the cohesion of the United Kingdom, not least of which the enfranchisement of young people and people who currently don't vote, not least of which the fact that it can act as a hygiene valve for our democracy by actually, there is a school of thought, and I think it is a reasonable and respectable school of thought. It may not be the dominant one, but there is a school of thought that if we had proportional representation and UKIP had 12 MPs, we would be in a much, much different position now, because it is a gift to populist parties to always be out of power, to have considerable popular support, but be out of power, because it means they can promise whatever.
Mhm.
They never have to work professionally on delivering anything. They never have to vote on a piece of legislation. It's a free ride. And I think we've given them a free ride for far too long. So yes, I think it would improve all of those things, but I think they are near the bottom of the list of the positive effects that reforming our electoral system would have. And I don't know if it should be simple proportional representation or some hybrid system, but certainly we need to be having a look at our constitutional setup.
Thank you. David, do you want to add anything?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you, Alex. Susan.
The next question is from Sarah, and it probably follows on quite well from the last one. And the progress back into Europe does depend on pragmatism. Then surely the first critical step has to be remove the current government from power, and that they need to be told electorally that they do not represent the British people, and that instead we wholly reject them and their dangerous populism. How strong has that message got to be, and how far would they need to lose to really take on that message, do you think?
No,
David?
I wouldn't quite put it. I wouldn't quite put it like that. I mean, I think that if you're looking at the Conservative Party, and this is, strange enough, I do think, like Alex, that it could well be the Conservative Party who are in the future ones who become more pro-European again. If the Conservative Party are not in power for a period of office, then that will have an effect on them. It always does. I don't think it matters, with the Conservatives, I suspect it doesn't matter awfully much whether they're out of power by 2 seats or 102. They've got a certain group of both their MPs and also their members who are virulently anti-EU. And while that's the case, they will continue to have the policies they have. And yes, if they lost a couple of elections, and frankly, demographics aging will take its toll as well, you may well find a different view. But I think there's a danger that I'm hearing here, which is lots of people are sort of a tick list of progressive causes that will all kind of go together, Conservatives not in government, proportional representation, EU, etc., and we can add lots of those, lots of things to it. I wouldn't be seeing the UK's relationship with the EU in that space at all. I would be seeing it very, it's very much always traditionally been a cross-party issue, and in order for the UK to have sustainable relations with the EU and of any sort, they will have to be sustainable on a cross-party basis. Now, might well take the Conservative Party a defeat or two to get to that point, but that apart, I would not see it in the same basket as many other issues that you perhaps are seeing it in. That's just my view, though. Alex may think differently.
Thank you, David. Alex?
No, I agree. I think that's spot on. And in many ways, I think we need to get out of the headspace that sees Brexit as part of a great regressive evil. Not that it wasn't, right? But I don't think it's helpful to keep treating it that way going forward, because actually it's a gift to the side that wants to take us further and further away from Europe. It is a gift to isolationists, because all these issues can act as recruitment tools, right? That's how UKIP achieved its popularity at European elections, which is what gave it the leverage over the Conservative Party. It sort of became a bucket list of anything that annoyed you, right? You want to smoke in a pub, vote UKIP. You hate, pride marches, vote UKIP. And so I think we mustn't make that the same mistake and group all those things together and say, oh, they belong to those people over there, because that's a great recruitment tool for them. We must challenge each of them individually on their merits. And we must make the case for a closer relationship with Europe, again, on its merits.
Thank you. Thanks both for that. Geraldine has the next question.
Yes, thank you. This is from David Blackman. There's been no mention by the speakers so far of the constitutional tensions that Brexit has created. 72% of Scots want their EU citizenship rights back. 95% plus of converts to yes for Scottish independence have been convinced because of Brexit. Apparently, Wales is massively more Indie curious than it was pre-2016. So will there actually be a UK to rejoin the EU? Who'd like to start with that one?
Yeah, I think personally, one of my Mystic Alex style predictions was that when the SNP failed to get a 50%, 53% of the vote at the last Scottish elections, that would be the high watermark of Scottish independence for some time, and I stand by that. So I think that yes, there was an issue, but narrowly, I now think that I don't think that Scotland being a part of the UK will return to being a live issue for a few years, and actually that's probably the same timescale as Northern Ireland. I think these are things that will come back, and that Northern Ireland is interesting. There are clearly demographic shifts going on, but if you actually look at the non-aligned community at the moment, by and large, it's happy to be part of the UK. So now you could envisage a situation where what happens is that you have a one-term Labour minority government, the Conservatives come back in even more, doing what they're doing now, except this time they really do want to leave the ECHR or whatever, and then you have political turmoil, and then those forces come back. But I think at the moment, we overplay, because they were real, but I think they have now peaked. The issues around Scottish, the chances of Scottish independence or Northern Ireland to having a border poll have, I think, receded, and I don't expect those things to happen in the next 5 years, let's say. I think it'll be more like 10 before they become issues again. Bold prediction, but we'll go with it.
I broadly agree with that. I think of the three, Northern Ireland is probably the one that is closest, under a particular set of events unfolding, that is probably the closest to leaving the UK, as it were. And that is simply a function of the fact that it can then go into something else. So it's not talking about independence, it's talking about leaving this entity and going to that entity that is already a member of the EU. And with an integrated all-island economy, I think that makes it practically easier. I'm not saying it's making it politically or demographically more likely, but I think it is practically a much easier proposition to sell. The rest is, I mean, I have great sympathy with the Scottish independence cause, actually, because emotionally, I think just the cumulative effect of being constantly dragged ever to the right when your electorate actually expresses consistently a different wish to go in the other direction, I think that does have a cumulative emotional effect. And I can absolutely understand why supporters of Scottish independence want Scotland to be independent. I am agnostic in terms of whether I support it or not, because there is also a part of me that sees the rest of the UK becoming poorer and more right-wing without Scotland. And so for purely selfish reasons, I would quite like them to stay in the Union, but I can understand the impulse to go. Beyond that, really, everything that happens becomes subsumed in the SNP's drive towards independence. So, you know, you can, if you follow Prime Minister's questions, every SNP leader's question on whatever issue, whether it's health or the EU, or whether it's, you know, education, or whether it's housing, ends with the sort of codicil that all of this would be much better if we were independent. And so I think the debate is at that level at the moment, where, you know, they have a really good case to make that you dragged us out of the EU against our wishes. And that becomes part of that pattern of being constantly made to do something you didn't vote for as a nation. And I think that's difficult. But the answer to it is really quite obviously a deeper level of devolution. And that is something that the Blair government recognized. And that's why the cause of independence was effectively put on hold for decades. And I think that's more likely where we will end up again. We will end up with more autonomy, more devolution, more powers, maybe even tax-raising powers. And so it will become a looser union, but I think it will still be a union.
Thank you, Alex. Before I ask the next question, I just feel I want to read out something from the chat. This is from Angela. I think both speakers massively underestimate how scundered both Northern Ireland and Scotland are with GB. If you guys elect another Tory government, we are most definitely off. So there. But my question, moving on, is...
Sorry, can I just say something to that, though?
Yeah, sure.
It's not if we elect it. It's not if you elect it. It's if we elect it, all right? Because there's also an argument that if Scotland doesn't want a Tory government, they should be voting for the alternative. I mean, I don't particularly wish the independent supporting people to jump on me, but I'm just saying you are active participants in this process. You're not somehow just spectators, even if legitimately it feels like that very often recently.
Sure. I think Angela may be speaking from Northern Ireland. So, and the political situation, as we know, is a bit different there. But moving on, this is a question from Ross Everly. Is Russian influence on our politics a factor that's relevant anymore?
I mean, of course it's relevant. It's relevant in all sorts of ways in our energy prices, in our availability of minerals, of grain. I mean, it is important in all sorts of ways. But I think with the relationship being what it is at the moment, the sort of direct influence that saw parties taking very large donations sort of 15 years ago from Russian oligarchs and sort of playing tennis matches with them, and you know, them being the new favorite people, and London becoming a dirty money laundromat. I think those days are gone, and probably gone for good.
David, do you want to add anything? No. Okay. Susan.
Yeah, so we're back to the Windsor framework again. And is there any indication of any movement from the DUP, and in terms of which way they might jump? And do you think the Windsor framework can proceed even if the DUP dig in and say no? And I'll just move one extra on. And if we do get the Windsor Agreement across the line, how long do you think it will hold? Or do you think it will hold as long as the Good Friday Agreement?
Yeah, no, good questions. Look, I think I think for a start, the Windsor Agreement is going to be implemented. Which in a way, that's the easy bit. I think there's a bunch of stuff there that the UK and the EU want to proceed with and will proceed with. You know, the arrangements for supermarkets and the green and red lanes. I think they'll proceed with that. That's the easy bit. How will the DUP then respond to this? Now, personally, right now, if I'm the DUP, I'm going to say no, because I haven't been offered enough to not say no right now. I've got some stuff. There's some stuff in there that looks nice, but you know, this is a negotiation as well with the DUP have held. They've held out for so long, and they're under a lot of pressure domestically to get more. I think they would, personally, I suspect they want to see more. I suspect that actually they can live with this a bit more than they could before. It hasn't given them everything they want, so they've got good reason to say yes, and they've got good reason to say no. So, given that, I think that they're probably hot. Personally, I still don't think they say yes straight away, but I'm not sure they say no straight away either. So they've got a panel that looks to me, and it's supposed to report by the end of the month, that looks to me, it's quite moderate in nature, but by DUP standard, I think that panel comes out and says something like, there are some very interesting things, but here's a list of things we'd like from the UK government. Or at least I would have thought that's the logical thing that you go on to. And then, yeah, and that turns into another negotiation. And that gets us on to the point of, you know, is it a stable framework for the long term? No. But is Northern Ireland's politics stable for the long term anyway? No. You know, you can't get this situation. You've got a political ambiguity anyway between unionists and nationalists. Now you've overlaid that with an economic ambiguity between EU and UK ties. And so you're essentially going to have that. Can that ambiguity ever be stable? No. Can that ambiguity be kind of worked with? Yeah, it can be. And I have the sense that personally, I think that I think Conservative governments struggle more with Northern Ireland than Labour governments, because Conservative governments actually want to try to sort of influence it more and say what should happen from a London point of view. And the only thing that the Northern Ireland parties really agree on is they don't like it when London interferes. And so I think Labour's more inclined to kind of try to facilitate a process where the Conservatives are more inclined to try and sort of force it. But it won't ever be fully stable. But is it a basis on which to move forward? Yes, it's probably a basis to move forward. It's a step forward. Let's put it that way at best. And I'm afraid at some length last Friday I wrote roughly that. So to be welcomed, it's decent, but you've just got to look at the overall framework to it to think, no, this doesn't make all problems go away. Mm-hmm. It couldn't.
The only thing I would add to that is that I just did a sort of big series of interviews with figures in Northern Ireland for a feature, and we have to remember that the DUP is not monolithic in its opinions. It is as divided on these things as any other party, and there are more moderate elements, fewer in the Westminster contingent of the DUP, more in the Stormont contingent of the DUP, that want to get back into Stormont and start governing and start doing business. And there are a few headbanger holdouts that will say no to anything. And so keeping that in mind and knowing that Donaldson, I think, is one of the more moderate voices on this issue, I think the constitution of this committee to look at the Windsor framework implies to me that he wants to get to a point where he can say, well, look, we constituted an independent committee to look at this, and they're recommending that we accept it, so we will. Because simply put, politically, the DUP, it makes sense for the DUP to hold out only if they believe they can gain something more, either a further concession in terms of the agreement, which will not happen because I think negotiations just wouldn't reopen so quickly, or a political concession from the Conservative government, which might happen, but again, seems to me quite doubtful, or an electoral advantage, which again, I don't think is the case. I think the DUP are getting battered at the moment in the polls for refusing to form a government in Stormont. And so it seems to me the gains of holding out are very, very small at the moment politically. And so constituting this committee to look at it seems to me like an elaborate way of moving towards saying a qualified yes.
So I slightly disagree. I think that it is an elaborate way of moving to a qualified yes, but only via another negotiation with the UK. So it's that bit. I think that they have they're still going to try and get some more out of the UK. That would be my take on it. And I'm not sure they will ever say yes. But
Just not say no.
Correct.
Yes.
That's right. They won't say no.
Yes. Thank you both. I think there's another question from Geraldine. Thank you.
Yes. Well, we're a pro-EU group here in Oxford, and there are people who've joined us from all over the country who are also involved with pro-EU groups. So we'd like some advice, really. This is a question from Linda Bradbury. Do you think the pro-European groups should be supporting the campaign to rejoin the EU afresh by highlighting only the positives about membership?
I think campaign groups should do whatever they want, right? I am all for pluralism, and I'll tell you why. So I'm not one of those people that considers those who say a gradual thawing of relations and coming closer. I don't consider them traitors to the Rejoin cause, and I don't consider people who advocate for Rejoin loons that are hurting the general cause, because I think both are completely honorable intellectual positions to hold, and they can both work in tandem, all right? So the groups that advocate Rejoin, I think, create the intellectual space in the political framework. They extend that Overton window so that when eventually we get onto that argument, it's not some novel argument that comes out of the blue, okay? So they're playing effectively the role that UKIP played in the mid-2000s. They are creating that political space. They're saying that thing that the other side hates them saying. And by doing that, I think they extend the space for someone like Starmer, for instance, to be able to say, well, look, we have these people saying this and these people saying that, and we're going to be somewhere down the middle because we're moderate and we want to take the whole country with us, right? Without the people saying this on one side, there is nothing to pull you in that direction. And so I think campaigning organizations and individuals should stop being prescriptive about what other people are advocating for. I think everyone should be free to advocate for the position they feel is right. And I think it's all useful provided it goes in the right direction. And I dislike this bickering between what is the right position to support and what is the wrong position to support. Having said that, demanding that the Labour Party adopt a rejoined position as a platform for the next election is nuts. I mean, it is nuts. If Sunak right now had a magic wand and had one wish, that is what he would wish for. All right? So cut it out. What I want is what I want. What the Labour Party should do in order to dislodge this ghastly government and get into power is a totally separate thing to what I want. And we must stop this infantile negative vetoing of everything by saying, oh, well, you said one thing that I completely disagree with, therefore I'm now blocking you on all social media and will never speak to you again. That is how children act. Let's be smart, let's be adults about this. There is space for a huge array of opinions on this issue, and as long as the arguments are made genuinely, authentically, passionately, and with reason, I welcome all of them.
Now, personally, I wouldn't be taking advice on campaigning from a trade expert, and I'll be pointing out honestly whatever I see, whether for good and bad, and up to anybody else whether they wish to do that or not. And I'm always put in mind whenever in honesty in politics, but I firmly believe in honesty in politics. There's this anecdote from many years ago of a US presidential candidate who was told that he had the support of all right-thinking people, and he said, "I need a majority."
Thank you.
The next question is from Jean, and it seems that changing public opinion is clearly a key to improving relations with Europe as the country changes to be more pro-European than it was. But are governments more influenced these days by global financial and economic influences, which may be strongly opposed to the UK having closer ties to the EU again? I'm not entirely sure who Jean had in mind about who may be opposed to us getting stronger, closer to Europe. Any thoughts?
I don't think that there are too many global economic interests who are opposed to the UK having closer relations with the EU, but I mostly think the decisions are made on politics first and foremost, which I think Alex already said.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would add to that is that, which I think is actually reason to be cheerful, is that if you look at the way the international community of nations has reacted to the United States since Trump left office and Biden came in, I also see that it's a quick change, that the world is very quick to embrace a country that adopts a more collaborative, less confrontational attitude, because it's what everyone wants. And so I would say that if going forward, we start walking the walk and displaying a more collaborative, more internationalist attitude, I think the international community will reciprocate very, very quickly and very generously, because it's what everyone wants.
Thank you both. And I think now we're up to the final question. Geraldine.
Yes. And thank you both for all your good advice this evening. Just one last question from Joe. To what extent might the illegal migration bill, which of course you can read in two ways, so reduce our standing in Europe that it'll add years before we can begin discussions?
If that's the last question, I'm going to then just sort of draw a few concluding thoughts, which is that I don't see it like that. So many things linked to so many other things. Look, I go back to how I finished my first intervention. We're a long way from that point. It's going to be a slow and steady process, I suspect, towards a closer relationship. There'll be swings and roundabouts on the way. There'll be stuff that we do that the EU doesn't like. You've also got to get something that hasn't come up, or I didn't bring it up enough. There's going to be things that the EU does in the next few years that the UK doesn't like. There are going to be things. Assume there's a Labour government and the Labour government says what we really want to do is this with the EU, and we think that they've actually asked for it, and the EU says, well, sorry, you can't have that. I mean, it's all very well the EU being kind of saying no to what was widely seen as unreasonable demands before, but what when they start saying no to things that are considered reasonable demands? So we're such a long way off. I wouldn't worry about individual little steps in the road so much. I wouldn't worry about the linkage with lots of policies. I think it's all about the sort of that big political picture of what kind of relationship the UK wants with the EU. I just really do bring it back to that one question: what kind of relationship do the UK and the EU have, and why? That's it. I really, it's not it. I mean, there's lots of other things will come into it, but ultimately keep boiling it down to that rather than trying to bring in every other issue. So I think that's my final word for the evening.
Okay, thank you.
So, I mean, as we already said, I don't think it's likely that, this piece of legislation is a political crowbar. It's not really a serious piece of legislation. And so I think we needn't treat it like that. But it does, I think, open up the conversation to the general link between sort of pro-European sentiment and the culture wars as they've come to be known. And I think there are lessons to be learned there. I increasingly believe that we've played that aspect wrong, actually, that we too easily received and accepted the wisdom that, the culture wars are for the right, that it's a mistake to get involved, that we must keep pushing the economic argument and all of that. I think the culture wars are something we must not run from any longer. Because the more ground we concede, the worse it seems to get. It is never ending. It's Brexit and the ECHR. Today, Farage was sounding off about leaving the UN Convention on Refugees. I mean, it's ridiculous. And yet, there it is. The question is, how do we treat it? Do we ignore it? Do we cross-talk on something else? Or do we take those arguments head on? And I increasingly think we need to fight the culture wars because I think we can win the culture wars, actually, because I think we are the silent majority, despite what the noisy minority has been saying for such a long time. And we have run away from these bullies for far too long. And there needs to come a point where we say, enough. It's enough. We make a stand here. And I think the issue of refugees is one that lends itself to that. I think it is one where we can appeal to people's best instincts without trying to shame them for having succumbed to their worst instincts. And And we must stop constantly locking horns. And I am entirely guilty of this with people who are on the unpersuadable fringe. Okay? We must always be talking to the people in the middle who feel conflicted about this stuff. That is our audience. And yes, engaging with people who have extreme views might be a really useful tool to expose their idiocy, but it must never be about that. And I think the same goes with Brexit Remain. I think something that has stymied the pro-European side of the argument for many, many years since the referendum is that we seem to crave this Damascene conversion where they go, you were right, we were wrong, how could we be so wrong, we are so sorry. It'll never happen, okay? We are trying to find a drug that doesn't exist. So I will introduce a little thought from my theatrical training here, just because I think it's interesting. Stanislavski wrote a lot about the circles of attention, right? Or spheres of influence. And he said that the first circle of attention is yourself. The second circle of attention is the people to whom you're directly talking to, all right? And if an actor concentrates on just those two, what's happening inside of me and what's happening across me on the stage, they miss the third circle of attention, which is the audience. You have to be conscious that in every one of those arguments, you are speaking to the world. You have to be conscious of the fact that when you're on TV, there are many more people who don't write in than do. When you are on social media, there are many more people who read the post but say nothing about it. They don't like it, they don't retweet it, they don't respond to it. That is the sphere of influence on which we always must concentrate. And that, I think, will dictate our behavior. If we are always behaving in a way that is seeking to convince someone ambivalent on whatever issue we're discussing, we will be doing a better job than if we're butting heads with someone who is unconvincible on it. So that is my advice. My advice is stay in touch with the people around you, stay in touch with your wider family, with the people you disagree, talk to them, not necessarily about politics. Don't beat them over the head with Brexit, but stay in touch. You know, always be seeking to say that you are there for them. That is the most effective tool, actually, for convincing people that your way is better. Being open and honest and kind. And we have slightly lost sight of that, I think. We've become legitimately angry. But anger is a really huge obstacle to effective communication. You know, it just makes you sound heated and irrational and aggressive. So let's get back to a place of calm. Let's do a little bit of breathing exercises like a good actor and go out there and understand that in any context in which we debate those issues, there is a wider audience. It might just be 2 people, it might be 10,000 people, but we are always talking to people who are convincible. That's my last thought.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, David, for your thoughts too. And I'm going to hand back to Lizzie now.
Yes, thank you both very much for the generosity you showed tonight in with your time and your thoughts. It's been a really insightful evening. I've the trade position of the slowly pragmatic moving towards a slightly better position, but it's never going to be a straight line. And yes, the advice of, still, pragmatic step-by-step persuasion, which is a very valuable thing to remember in these very turbulent times. I think with a government that drives wedge issues, it's easy to get caught up in the in the anger and the sort of the stress of it all. So yes, been very valuable, and I hope you've provided some hope, even if it's a little way in the distance. It's incremental. There is that mooring position somewhere in the shore. I will pass over to our chair, and I just wanted to say thank you all for your attendance before I go. Thank you very much for the audience to attend, and to our very great speakers for their time and generosity tonight. Thank you. Over to Peter.
Thank you, Lizzie. I just wanted to add my thanks. Before I do, I'm going to give you a little job to do, as I always do at these meetings. And that is that if you are as fascinated as I by the chat, and there's been a lot of it, you have the option of saving it. If you're on a PC, you can go to the bottom of the chat and you'll see 3 little dots, and you can click those and save the chat on your computer. And I think there's a lot of food for thought, and I've learned some new words on this evening's chat. So while you're doing that, I'll just say a special word of thanks to our 2 speakers, and to David for really casting a very perceptive and informed and expert legal light on so much of what's happening at the moment, and allowing us to see it, and I think in a very nuanced way, as he always does in his publications. And I'm confirmed in my belief that I must follow him in great detail. And to Alex for speaking so wonderfully and answering the questions so fully. And I think one of the things I'm going to take away from what Alex said is the importance of actually respecting each other's views, even if we don't necessarily see eye to eye. And of course, there are many shades of opinion within the Remain movement, or within the Rejoin movement, or the pro-European movement, however you describe it. And I think to castigate each other for being actually too enthusiastic or too lacking in enthusiasm is a mistake. And I like the way he described us as the silent majority. I think that's true. I mean, the figures are now showing the vast majority of people, or an increasing majority of people, are at the very least skeptical about the benefits of Brexit. And I think our new slogan should be borrowed from the Leave side. We can now say that our mission as Oxford for Europe, and indeed as the European movement, will be going from this moment forth to exercise and implement the will of the people. And that genuinely is what we're doing. I think the criticism that we're being undemocratic is long dead. So my special thanks also to Lizzie for chairing the meeting so well, and to Geraldine and Susan for asking the questions, and for Joe for working in the background and going through many questions on the chat. I would like to thank the people who have asked the questions, because they really have been quite perceptive and have made us think, and to all of you for taking part in this meeting. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things before we finish. First of all, I know very many of you have kindly donated on entering, and there's still an option to make donations to Oxford for Europe. We're always open to that, because we're actually running quite a vigorous social media campaign, and that has costs. So every penny that's donated goes towards spreading the message further and wider. So please do. You'll see on our website how to do that. Our website address is Oxford for Europe, all one word, .org, very simple. And please keep an eye out for future meetings, which we will hopefully notify you about. If you want to go on our mailing list, the details of how to do so are on the website, and please do. A final thing, as you probably know, we are affiliates of the European Movement. European Movement is a very, very worthy cause, and I hope as many of you as are interested will actually join and become active members and take part in our campaigns. For those of you who are already members, I'm just going to remind you that there are 10 days to go before the close of polling for the new chair, and please do vote if you have the opportunity. All the details can be found on the European Movement's website, and there are 3 excellent candidates. We hope a good turnout will actually help to spread the word about how important and vigorous the European movement is. That is the last thing I'm going to say. I've unmuted everybody, so if you'd like to show your appreciation to our speakers in the usual way, you can unmute yourselves and just give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.